All right, well, thanks so much. And thank you all for joining. I know it's a lot to join yet another webinar at this point in the pandemic. So I really appreciate your attention to this issue and to just getting on here one more time. Of course, this will be the best one you've ever been on. So you made an excellent choice. So my name's Dana Flightman. I'm with the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, or SPARC, which is a project of Equitas funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. And today we're, of course, talking about stalking, but we're actually focusing more on how to talk about stalking. So this session is SPARC, a dialogue, building stalking awareness in January and beyond. And, we always want to remember that there are 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. But a lot of times it's kind of like, and stalking. We almost call their website andstalking.org because so often it's an afterthought in our field as well as in our general public discourse. And, there's been an increase in national conversations about sexual violence and to a lesser extent, intimate partner violence. But stalking really doesn't always enter into that conversation. But the reality is that it should, because stalking is prevalent, it is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. It is a major crime that the victims, survivors, and offenders, depending what your role might be, are experiencing or perpetrating, but it often goes unrecognized and unnoticed, again, both within our field and in the general public. And so the way that we talk about stalking, the way we integrate it into our day-to-day operations at our organization, as well as the way that we talk about it to our community, recognizing that most victims talk to a family or friend first. Family member or friend first, right? How does that person respond? Where is stalking in our national discourse around victimization? And we can all play a role in elevating that. And my goal today is to really just have you move that and stalking a little bit more to the beginning of your sentence and see the great work that you're already doing through the lens of stalking, both this January in Stalking Awareness Month and beyond. So if you've already been talking stalking a lot this month, that's great. If not, we still have almost 20 days left. And of course, for us at SPARC, it always feels like Stalking Awareness Month. So it's always a good time to have programming and education around stalking. So like I said, SPARC is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking. And our website is stalkingawareness.org. On there, we have practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline, including a section for awareness educators, as well as for campus professionals, which includes campus-specific resources. We also have for victim services, for law enforcement, for prosecution, and others. We have training modules, and I'll mention some of those today. I'm lucky to be joined by my colleague Julia, who's on the call, who will share in the chat, as I mentioned, some of the resources we have. But we have some programs that you could just pick up and lead with scripts and videos, etc. So you can talk stalking in your community without having to reinvent the wheel. We are not a direct service provider, but we know that victims come to us for information on stalking because there are a few sources of information. So we offer fact sheets, we have brochures like this one that you can order from us on understanding stalking, and just a lot of general guidance around recognizing and responding, and webinars like this one. So if after this you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk more, you are in luck because we have recorded webinars in our archives. And since we're called SPARC, I got us to call it the SPARchives, which is pretty much the pinnacle of my professional achievement. So you can check us out in the SPARchives for more content on stalking. We're also on social media. Our handle on there is at Follow Us Legally if you get our sick sense of humor at SPARC. If not, it'll be a long afternoon for you. So your call either way, but I hope you will connect with us. We won't be scared. We asked you to. It is legal. On Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and sign up for our newsletter. As an anti-stalking organization, we're pretty mindful about not contacting people without their consent and or excessively. And so if you do want to hear from us, we send emails around quarterly. So it's not something we're sending all the time. And I really hope that you will connect with us year round. So just a quick refresher, and again, today's a little different for me anyways, because usually I'm explaining stalking in depth. And today I'm going to offer just a really quick refresher on what stalking is and why we should care, and then get right into those awareness strategies for within an organization and within our general public. So I'm going to start with this. If you've been on webinars previously, and if you haven't been on a stalking webinar before, I highly recommend Context is Key, which is recorded in our archives, or I'm sorry, in the SPARchives. Not only am I biased because I'm the one who did that session, but I really do think it's a good one for laying the foundation for what is stalking, what are stalking behaviors, how does it intersect with especially domestic and sexual violence, and what are some big picture tips for response. So definitely, if you haven't listened to that, please do. But if you have listened to that, you know that I always start with a spiel about stalking being criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. And so I actually created this video so that you can do the spiel without having to work too hard in any awareness programming that you might offer. So this is a video, it's free on our website, just kind of set the foundation for why talk about stalking. So I'll go ahead and give that a play.
So why take the time to learn about stalking? Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. Stalking is criminal. It is a crime across the United States. That means it's a crime at the federal level, in all 50 states, U.S. territories, tribal lands, and in our military justice system. It might be a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation. A lot of people don't realize that stalking is a crime. And so many victims are left wondering, well, what, should I call the police because somebody rang my doorbell or drove by my house? And the answer is that victims can consider reporting to authorities as well as documenting the stalking. Stalking is traumatic. Many stalking victims experience mental health impacts, including depression, anxiety, insomnia, and social dysfunction. Quite a few also lose time from work, many lose their jobs altogether, and a significant number of stalking victims choose to relocate. In fact, 1 in 7 stalking victims move as a result of their victimization. It's important to hear from stalking victims and survivors in their own words. This survivor said, "I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." And finally, stalking is dangerous. Stalking often co-occurs with physical violence, including physical assault, sexual violence, and rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. And yet so often, these early signs of danger are ignored as, oh, it's just texting, it's just ringing the doorbell. In fact, one researcher went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. So what's the good news? The good news is that we have an opportunity, because stalking is one of the few crimes where early intervention can prevent trauma, violence, and even death. When we recognize those early signs, take them seriously, connect victims to resources, and hold offenders accountable, we can keep our communities safe from this prevalent and terrible crime. That's why it's so critical that you learn about stalking and how to know it, name it, and stop it.
Right, well put. Who narrated that? Oh my goodness, they seem so smart. Okay, so that is why we've got to learn about stalking. And yes, this video is available on our website and on our YouTube channel, and you can share it and integrate it however you like into your programming. So what exactly is stalking? Well, briefly, we want to remember there's the behavioral definition and the statutory definition. Every state has a different stalking statute to make it a little bit confusing. It's also a crime tribal lands and the military justice system. It violates student conduct codes. And so you want to be looking at your state jurisdiction as well as your institution to make sure that you are familiar with your statute. I'm going to talk about the behavioral definition today because that gives us the best sense of what stalking really is and what stalking really looks like. If you're from an area with a really I'd say difficult, narrow stalking statute, it might be that you're explaining to a victim, hey, what you're experiencing is stalking. We want to identify that risk, safety plan around it, and work with you. And if you go to law enforcement, they might tell you this doesn't meet our stalking statute. We still want to know that stalking behavior is happening, though, and that's really what we want to be able to identify that for our victims, right? And so behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. So to break this down slightly, it's a pattern of behavior that's behaviorally 2 or more incidents. Also in most state statutes, it's 3 or more. It uses a reasonable person standards. It's directed at a specific person, so not at a group of people, not a peeping Tom randomly looking in a locker room. That might still be a crime, but stalking is directed at someone specific, and it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear or emotional distress. So when we're talking about emotional distress, we're talking about, that fear for your physical safety, bodily harm, as well as fear for emotional safety. And I don't mean that in a touchy-feely way. I mean that in terms of, can this person live a normal life? Or do they feel that they are under surveillance, that their life is being invaded, that they're being interfered with, that they're being intimidated or threatened? When someone feels like they are under that kind of stalking, again, surveillance, life invasion, interference, intimidation, or it's impacting their life, that's really when we're talking about emotional distress. If you look up emotional distress in most statutes, it'll say like distress that is emotional in nature. So that's not super helpful. But this is what we're talking about, not a minor annoyance or grievance. Really, that's something that's more consuming than that. But fear's tough because fear is very personal, and context is absolutely critical in stalking cases. A lot of times what seems scary to a victim may seem benign or even nice to an outsider. So the classic example is an offender saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? So the victim receives roses, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, that's so lovely, because they don't know that context. And so often if a victim's very upset, in fear, etc., it may not make sense to you as the responder at first. So what you want to do is respectfully ask them, tell me the story behind that. What message did that send to you? Give me more information, because they probably know something you don't, and there probably is more to it. Now, stalking is a very prevalent crime. We know that stalking impacts people of all gender identities, absolutely, but this is the best available national data, that's why I'm repeating it to you in this binary way. But we know that at least 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men experience stalking in their lifetimes. So again, we know this is underreported, just like intimate partner violence and sexual violence. But even if we take this at its word, we have sexual violence impacting around 1 in 5 women, domestic violence impacting 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, depending what study you're looking at. So stalking is really right up there in terms of the prevalence. And so when you think about who's coming through your doors and what victims have experienced, it's very likely that they've experienced stalking victimization, but often it's missed because we just don't talk about it or screen for it as much as we do for those other kinds of victimization. Now, the vast majority of the time, the victim knows the offender knows the victim. And about half the time, that offender is a current or former intimate partner. So there's a huge relationship here with intimate partner violence. That being said, that also means about half the time that's not related to intimate partner violence, right? It might be an acquaintance. It can be a stranger, though it's relatively rare, a family member, or a person of authority, like a supervisor or a law enforcement officer or someone like that. So I encourage you to think about, are you serving all victims of stalking, those that are intimate partner violence related and not? If you're not, do you know where to refer them? And if you are, that's great, but would they know how to find you? Because if I'm being stalked by, say, a neighbor and there was no sexual or romantic relationship, I'm unlikely to pick up the phone and call the Family Violence Center, right? Or the rape crisis services, because that's not what I'm experiencing. And yet that's where the response is most likely to be housed. And so I encourage you to think about, is the word stalking on your website? Do you share stories about intimate and non-intimate partner stalkers, etc.? And we'll talk about some more strategies for that later. Now, on average, while all stalkers can be dangerous, our intimate partner stalkers pose the greatest threats to their victims. So again, the presence of threats and violence here is not zero for any kind of stalker, but typically that access and information that an intimate partner has about their victim gives them more opportunity to scare their victims, which is what stalking is all about, as well as they might know, they know where your mom lives and her phone number. They're in your social network. They might know the password that you have. They know where you go when you go to the gym and where you go to the grocery store. And so that knowledge and access, as well as that extension of power and control, on average, makes them the most dangerous. So like I said, pose the greatest threats to their victims. Now, I don't expect that to surprise you all on the call. I'm sure you're like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Most victims and offenders know each other, and those intimate partners are probably the most dangerous. I expect that to be pretty obvious to all the folks listening. But to most people, it isn't. For most of our stalking victims, they're thinking about stranger stalkers, and they're not thinking about those intimate partners. And so that's a myth that we have to fight, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, there are a ton of stalking behaviors. I don't have time to go through them in much detail at all today, but this is just to expand our thinking on stalking, that it's not just surveillance. How is an offender tracking, watching, monitoring, gaining information about a victim? It could also be life invasion. How are they showing up in the victim's life? And we often see that through constant contact. That's the most common form, those texts, emails, calls. Interference through sabotage or attack. So spreading rumors, discrediting the victim, hacking into accounts, property damage like slashing tires. All of that can interfere, as well as intimidation, those explicit or implicit threats. And these overlap and intersect, which is fine, but just to expand our thinking that anything that's scary, that isn't the first thing that's happened, could be stalking. So we definitely want to use the word stalking when we're describing all of those behaviors. So why build awareness? Hopefully you see some utility, or you wouldn't be signing up for the session, right? But sometimes folks push back and they're like, what's the point of an awareness campaign? What's the point of an awareness program if it doesn't do anything? And so I certainly wouldn't say that awareness solves stalking, but it has some very practical applications, because there are a lot of myths about stalking. So the facts I just shared about stalking are not common knowledge, and our myths about stalking negatively impact some very real things that are important to all of us. Victim help seeking, how their informal supports respond, when they tell that friend, when they tell that family member, how we provide victim services. Do we identify it as stalking or not? And our criminal justice response, because these myths don't just impact our victims, they also impact us as responders. And so with public awareness, no, again, I'm not saying this resolves all stalking, but it can help folks to identify stalking behaviors when they happen, to dispel those myths, to recognize potential danger, because so often stalking is not treated with the urgency that it really requires, to seek appropriate help and resources, and to affect cultural change and public discourse. Because the majority of stalking victims do not report or seek services, similar to domestic and sexual violence, right? Most victims are not looking for services. Depending what study you look at, certainly less than 40% report to law enforcement. And if you're talking about a college campus, the numbers are lower, fewer than 30% are seeking their services on campus. And so most people are not identifying what's going on as stalking and then necessarily reporting it or seeking help and getting to folks like you who could help improve their lives and their safety. So why not? Why not report to police? Well, and of course, a lot goes into a victim's decision to engage the criminal justice system, but at least this study found these are some of the top reasons, and I think they'll resonate with you all as similar to reasons why domestic and sexual violence are not reported, right? Feeling like it's personal, it's not important enough. And while, again, stalking awareness doesn't resolve all of these barriers, I put a star here next to the ones it could sure help with, which is a very significant amount of that underreporting. The notion that it's a private or personal matter. We know that domestic violence was seen that way not long ago. And it's really a cultural shift that has led to folks saying, no, that's a crime. Third parties should care. We should intervene. This is about our community safety, not with what happens in the privacy of your home. And again, that's really a cultural shift about awareness and understanding of domestic violence, how prevalent it is, how dangerous it is, how much it impacts people around us, as well as this minimization. Now, sure, it's possible there really was a minor incident that someone felt wasn't worth reporting, and that might happen, forever. But there's also a lot of minimization on behalf of stalking victims and survivors. A lot of survivors don't say, oh, I don't want to make it a big deal. Maybe I'm overreacting. I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. And they really minimize the actual harm that they're experiencing. Having more dialogue about stalking and what it is and it isn't and the actual harms and dangers could absolutely help with that, as well as that not being clear a crime occurred. A lot of folks don't even recognize that stalking is criminal or something that could or should be reported, right? And again, a lot goes into that decision making. But as opposed to, let's say, robbery, we're all like, oh, yeah, that's illegal. You could report that. You can decide if you want to report that. With stalking behavior, especially because stalkers often engage in a variety of behaviors, some that are crimes on their own, like, say, property damage, slashing a tire, with other crimes that aren't crimes on their own, right, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So it's not illegal to send someone flowers. It's not illegal to text someone. It's not illegal to drive by someone's home, but those can become criminal in the context of stalking. And so some stalkers are only doing that latter category. They're showing up in public places, they're watching, they're sending gifts, they're sending messages. A victim may or not recognize that's a crime, which it is. And also that sense of shame and embarrassment, feeling that, this is personal, this is a reflection on me and not on the offender, blaming themselves. And so again, all of these, which is, over half the reasons that we're seeing this underreporting, could certainly be helped by a higher level of public awareness and dispelling some of those myths around stalking. So like I already said, most victims and offenders know each other. It's often an intimate partner. Again, I expect you all to know that already. But when I look for pictures of stalking online, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff I get. So you get these kind of strangers, alleyways, hoodies, very similar to the stranger rapist myth, if you're familiar with that. And this is what most folks are thinking of when they think of stalking. They're thinking a stranger in the alleyway or jumping out of the bushes. They're thinking of a secret admirer sending like a ransom style note, or they're thinking about celebrity stalkers. So, an obsessed fan who imagines and is delusional about their relationship with someone. And while all those things can happen, it's typically not what we're working with the victims and survivors that we're talking to, right? Because again, not all, but most victims and offenders know each other. And this really impacts reporting as well as response, because if you're the victim here in the middle, well, who looks scary? It's going to be Mr. Trenchcoat, right? Not this person that you know and maybe who's giving gifts or was a partner or who used to be a friend, etc. And so we find this playing out that victims who knew their offenders, they're more likely to be fearful. Like we said, it's actually a higher risk, right? But they're less likely to report to police than those stalked by a stranger. So it's not that they're not afraid. They might sense this person is really dangerous, but because it doesn't fit this myth narrative of what a stalking situation looks like, they're like, well, that my ex is freaking me out, but that's not like a stalker in a trench coat, so I'm not going to call that in, right? This study found a similarity in that view between non-specialist police officers and laypersons. So specialist police officers were like, nope, it's the ex-partners you got to look out for, right? And the acquaintances, the more someone knows, the more dangerous they might be. But non-specialist law enforcement, as well as just the general public, shared this common misperception that, no, it's the strangers who are really scary. And I could tell you, talking to a victim, she was stalked twice in her life, totally different incidents. And once it was by an ex-partner and once it was by a homeless man with mental health issues. Well, guess which one got the more urgent response? It was certainly the homeless man with mental health issues who better fit this narrative of who's dangerous and who's a problem in our community. But when the victim was truly scared for her life, it was the ex-partner stalking her. So it really does impact this. And in terms of charging, this was a study in the state of Colorado, about 1,800 cases of domestic violence, about 300 involve clear documented evidence of stalking. So that's not always happening, right? Victims aren't always calling it in. When they are, they don't always have the evidence. But here we have 298 cases with documented evidence of stalking. How many do you think were charged as stalking, like got a stalking charge? It was one. Only one case was charged as stalking. And a lot goes into charging decisions. I understand that. But the point I'm making is that this crime is not being recognized, both by victims and by responders. And again, we know that most stalking victims, just like with sexual or dating violence, they tell a friend, family member, or someone else they know and trust first. And so that person's response makes a huge difference in if they continue to seek help and seek services or not. And there's a lot of minimization of stalking in our general discourse. So it's not that we don't hear about stalking, it's that we hear about it incorrectly. So you've probably heard or said something like this, oh my God, I was totally stalking your pics on Insta. I was stalking you on Facebook. Oh my God, not to stalk you, but I have to email again, that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that causes stalking behavior. Stalkers choosing to stalk causes stalking behavior, right? But at the same time, it does kind of dilute the seriousness of the term because it creates this false sense that we know what stalking is and it's not that big a deal, when actually most folks have no idea what stalking is, and it is kind of a big deal. And when that friend says, hey, I'm experiencing stalking, what response do they get? Does that friend that they trust say, hey, that sounds serious, let's get you some help? Or is it like, okay, but are you experiencing, is it like stalking or is it stalking? Or is it cute though, right? And it's a bit unique to this crime, that level of minimization, I would argue. Like no one would say, oh man, that party was so lit, it's arson. Like that's not a thing. If you say there was arson at your home, your friend's gonna be like, oh my God, there's arson? Dude, you gotta call the police. Like there's freaking arson. But if you say, I think it's stalking, you get this more wishy-washy, or you're more likely to get this wishy-washy, like, oh, but is it though? And so we're combating that as well, that minimization and normalization in terms of taking it seriously. But it's okay, we're gonna fix it. So first I'm gonna talk about awareness within our field. And so the first thing is just to recognize these co-occurring victimizations. I'm sure a lot of folks on this call are coming primarily from agencies that work on sexual violence, domestic violence, or both of those. There are few, if any, standalone stalking resources. So you want to certainly ask your stalking victims about sexual and domestic violence, but also make sure you're asking your sexual and domestic violence victims, who are primarily coming to you for those reasons, about stalking behavior, because there is a huge co-occurrence within these. And they often get missed by our victim service providers. So is that standard in your agency? Do you talk about all these kinds of victimizations together? Do you talk about stalking as much as you talk about these others? Because again, there's few, if any, standalone stalking agencies. And so it's on you, unfortunately, for better or worse, to add stalking on to what you might consider your primary mission, right? Because there's nowhere else for these victims to go. Do you name stalking throughout your agency when you see it? And there's some reasons that naming stalking is so critical. The first is those charging and prosecution options if your victim's going that route. Most prosecutors like having a menu of options. You want to have that accountability for stalking and kind of reinforce that it is indeed a crime. And stalking is also a really strategic charge for prosecutors. And I'll tell you why. Because if they're prosecuting, say, an incident of domestic violence, the court's going to try to limit them to that 10 minutes of violence or alleged violence. But if they're charging stalking, they can bring in the entire course of conduct. So those creepy details that are haunting you now, the send you roses the day I kill you, now the judge and jury gets to hear that. And it paints a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender is. We also want to name it for safety planning. Stalking has its own risks. It requires its own safety planning, and it's also an indicator that there are other likely co-victimizations going on. If we just call it emotional abuse or digital abuse or don't name it at all, we miss that part, that opportunity to say, oh yeah, stalking. This is criminal, it's traumatic, it's dangerous. This person's at higher risk for a variety of different victimizations, including homicide. I'm going to activate the part of my brain that's thinking about surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, interference. I'm going to recognize those co-occurring victimizations. I'm going to realize that this might be a higher risk case. Again, we miss that if we don't call it stalking. And even if it's just victim empowerment, even if a victim is like, I'm not going to do any of that. Like, I don't want to report it. I don't want to change anything in my life, even just to be able to say, I'm stalking, and that's a real thing, and there's resources available, and if I Google it, there will be information. Even that can go a long way. There are some just passive ways to do this in your organization. So have stalking posters in your office. Have stalking brochures like this available for your victims and survivors. Is the word stalking on your website? And do you link to relevant resources? So if you're saying, hey, these statistics are from RAINN for your sexual violence, that's great. Are you also sharing, but if it's stalking, here's some resources from the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. If you're ever sharing the RAINN hotline or the DV hotline, you know, just a, hey, if you don't know where to go, contact these. Make sure you're sharing Victim Connect as well. And again, that your social media accounts are sharing a variety of stalking, you know, stories and resources. So if you look at this little picture here, I'm not saying, yeah, just put a stalking poster in your office and we'll end stalking. But the truth is, creating an environment where you're seeing the word stalking every day would actually be a cultural shift within our agencies for many of them, right? Because we see the word rape, we see domestic violence, we see the lady in the corner who looks sad, right? We see that imagery again and again, but we're not always seeing stalking accurately. So even small things like this can make a big difference, and just kind of passively letting your staff know, as well as your victims that come in, that, oh, hey, we work on this too. This is something to consider also. And again, these are free on our website. You can order them. I'm sure Julia will share a link in a second. We also have infographics available. These are something that you can just have out or share with folks from relevant communities. We have them on the intersection of stalking and domestic violence, on college campuses, on LGBTQ plus individuals. So again, if you have, say, you're primarily an LGBTQ plus resource center, if you have something on abuse, make sure you have something on stalking. And if you're from a community and saying, but SPARC, you don't have anything, let us know, because we're always looking to add and create more resources. So just sharing this and having it be available as much as you're sharing those, you know, other statistics for related crimes. And just think through, you know, is stalking part of your coordinated community response? How are stalking cases reviewed? Does stalking make it into those conversations? How are stalking cases identified? Do you routinely screen victims for stalking victimization? And we have tools that can help you do that. But, you know, when everyone walks through the door, do you ask them questions about stalking? Yes or no? Does your staff have training on stalking? And if so, that's great. How often is it offered? Are your new staff up to date? Do you participate in National Stalking Awareness Month, which is in January, every January, as I'm sure you knew. But, you know, there's a little less noise for Stalking Awareness Month than we see for sexual assault in April or domestic violence in October. And we want to change that. Even just putting the logo on your, you know, signature or something like that can go a long way. And basically, is your staff familiar with strategies for safety planning? Would you say, oh yeah, my staff knows how to safety plan around that? They think about assessing risk. They know about the risk assessment for stalking. They're monitoring cases for that. So I'm actually curious if you could just, and this is anonymous, so you won't get anyone in trouble here. How would you rank your organization's kind of internal awareness of stalking, or how it's integrated into your mission and day-to-day work? Do you feel like, oh yeah, we're always talking stalking, and absolutely, we ask every victim about it? Do you feel like, okay, like we bring it up, I mean, it happens, or, oh yeah, and stalking, it doesn't come up very often for us. I'll give you a few more seconds to answer that. All right, I'm closing it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and sharing results. So it looks like we have a mix here. We have a few organizations that are saying, oh yeah, we're always about this life. That's great. And please feel free to share in the chat some strategies or resources you've used. There's certainly no one expert on stalking or stalking awareness, so it's great to learn from folks in the field about what they're doing and what's working. So most people are saying, okay, like we know about it, but we have room to grow. But then a good 1 in 5 of you are saying, well, we don't really talk about stalking. And, usually when I do these trainings in person about stalking, which I do across the country for audiences, including campuses, law enforcement, victim services, prosecutors, mental health practitioners, I start by asking folks, is this the first time you've had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking? And usually it's half of the whole room raising their hands. And that's not a reflection on them as professionals doing great work in our field, but it is a reflection that this is undertrained and just really not talked about enough. So I appreciate you reflecting on that. And for folks who are thinking low or, hey, we have room to grow, I hope you will consider some of these questions. And we do have a checklist of questions like this that you can ask at your next staff meeting and have fun thinking about, hi, is it on our website? Where do we have those posters out? How are we talking about this within our agency? This is a quick tool for screening for stalking. The full version is the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile. But even just to ask these few questions of just about every victim who comes in, because if you ask most folks, are you experiencing stalking? They're going to say, nah, it's not stalking. But if you break it down to these smaller questions about these different kinds of stalking behavior, you're likely to get more information. So I encourage you to do that and to integrate that into your organizational practices. Like I said, the full risk assessment is SHARP. This is available at coercivecontrol.org, and we link to it on our website as well. This is a risk assessment specifically for stalking. It's free, it's online, it's really great. So if you're using LAP or Mosaic, those are wonderful, but they don't really focus on stalking behavior. So if you're working with a victim and you're thinking, I think there's stalking going on here, and I always say, well, ask all the questions, ask about this behavior, ask about that behavior. What are all the questions? Well, they're really in this assessment. It's too long for your responding officer, but it takes about 15 minutes, so great for victim services, or just if you're concerned about somebody. This is when I've had victims come to me, or friends of friends or whatever, and say, I don't know, it might be stalking. I say, do the SHARP assessment, because it creates a narrative report that lets you know, okay, based on what you said, you have a low, medium, high risk. Here's what's going on. It makes it really clear and understandable and offers some basic safety planning suggestions. So if that's new to you all, I highly recommend you check it out. And we have a recorded webinar of our director going through this with a sample case, so you can test it out ahead of time too. In terms of resources, again, if you're working with folks in our multidisciplinary field and saying like, ooh, I'm not sure if they're quite up on stalking, or I don't know if I'm up on stalking, check out our resources. Again, we have this broken out by discipline, and we're always adding more. So, we know it takes multidisciplinary professionals to be the change here, and that's why we have that. So that's kind of stalking very broadly in terms of, I really encourage you to reflect on your organizational or agency response to stalking. Both, I know most folks here from the victim services end, but from the criminal justice end as well. If you're a corrections or probation officer, are you screening for stalking behavior, even if it's not a stalking offender? Because those behaviors often get missed. If you're in law enforcement and stalking comes in as a property crime, is anyone looking at that whole picture and saying, oh no, this isn't just property crime, this same person's calling and they're doing this, and this is a stalking case, I'm going to get this to our domestic violence folks, right? And so there's a lot of work to do there, and I know it's easier said than done, but I do just encourage you to reflect on that, recognizing that our system does often miss these victims and that there's no real standalone place for them to go. So it's kind of up to us to catch it. Now, in terms of our public awareness programming, I'm kind of curious what you're all doing now. So I have, let's see, one more poll for you. Do you provide training on stalking to the general public? And so some folks are going to say, well, we don't do that, period, so no. So I gave you that option. But for the agencies that do public awareness training, do training on campus, through Title IX or whatever, I'm kind of curious, do you offer, yep, we do the stalking training, we're standalone programs? Or are you like, well, we talk about it, it's part of other things like harassment training or dating violence, or just, nope, that's just not something that we've offered before. So I'll give you a few more seconds to answer. All right, I'm closing it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so about 1 in 5 are saying that's just not what our agency does, so fair enough. But for the folks who do, it's pretty split between yes, no, and kind of. Right, with most folks saying, yeah, stalking comes up in other training, but we don't necessarily offer, a stalking training specifically. And it's rare that I see just a stalking training. And one thing I want to say is that, I understand this, and I'm not mad. I understand this because my background is doing public awareness training, and I was told, hey, can you go to this campus and talk about dating abuse, sexual assault, bystander intervention, and gender norms, have a group activity, have a group video, make it fun, you have 90 minutes. So if someone came to me and was like, add stalking, I'd be like, absolutely, stop, no. So I totally understand that it can be hard. And so while I do encourage standalone stalking trainings, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, this is my unofficial campaign, Sister, Can You Spare a Slide? And really, if you only have time for one slide on stalking in your presentation that's primarily about dating abuse or sexual assault, it's still a lot better than nothing. And you could share a slide that says something like this. This is on our website as well. Just, what is stalking? Pattern of behavior causes fear. Here's some examples of it. Usually it's someone you know, can happen during or after a relationship. If you're worried, seek help. Obviously, there's a lot more information than this on stalking in the world, and I'm happy to give all of it to you. But even this goes a long way to just name stalking, right? Just have the word stalking in your training and just point out, hey, this is a thing too. Similarly, if you're talking about, say, emotional abuse, so let's say you're talking about dating abuse and you say this is what physical abuse is, this is what emotional abuse is, just point out that some of those behaviors are also stalking. So this doesn't add a lot of time to your session to say, hey, and some of these are also stalking, which can be a form of emotional abuse and often intersects with intimate partner violence. And if you think you're experiencing stalking, there are some risks associated and resources available. So, make sure you reach out. That's all even just that, just saying, hey, by the way, these are stalking. Let's think about it that way. It can go a very long way. Also, if you're going through a case example, let's say you're doing a case study or you're sharing, a victim or survivor story. If there's stalking within that case, which there often is, list those behaviors. So I remember back when I was doing a lot of education on campus, the story we often use with Yardley Love for dating abuse, homicide from UVA. And so to talk about that primarily as a dating violence case, but you could also talk about, hey, this offender also stalked the victim. He went through her computer, he broke into the home, he followed her, he seemed to know who she was hanging out with. It's important to realize that's a crime in its own right, and it can be dangerous. Even just that is a lot more than most folks are hearing about stalking typically. You can also integrate it into your bystander intervention. So I know bystander intervention education is really popular. And one of the tricky things with stalking is that because it's definitionally a pattern of behavior, a lot of times I hear bystander education kind of focused on an incident. Right. So the classic example is like you're at a party and you see this happen and how do you, distract, delegate, etc. And that's great. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying that might stop one moment of stalking, but it's only one part of that pattern. And so that's still worthwhile to do. And you can absolutely talk about that in your bystander intervention programming, but also thinking more broadly about that cultural and norms change. Right. So things about, hey, don't ask your roommate where she is. She'll text you if she wants you. That talking to your friends about that, that's stopping the normalization, calling people out. It's not right to look through their phone like that. Are you waiting here for this person? That's creepy. You should go. Right. So that kind of change as well, in addition to stopping, a specific incident, are all things that are worth integrating into your bystander programming. Also, while of course we want to talk about stalking during Stalking Awareness Month, it intersects with every other issue, as far as I'm concerned. Some more obviously than others. I will find you a connection if you can't. But we talk about stalking year round, of course, and we talk about the intersection. So here's just some sample posts from us from different months, right? So next month's Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, guess what? A lot of teens experience stalking. So we'll be posting about that. So even just sharing that, or when you're thinking about a different issue, think, could stalking intersect here? Let me make sure I have a fact, a slide, a something about that as well. And so, we always do that, especially for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, domestic violence. But really, with specific populations, every population experiences stalking. So if you're focusing on a specific group or co-occurring crime, try to bring stalking into that as well. So standalone programming. So those are things that I truly think make a big difference from where we currently are with our discourse on stalking. If you don't have time to do the standalone, do something, right? But if you do have time, or the spaciousness, the capacity, etc., doing a program just on stalking is certainly worthwhile, and there's different ways you can do that. So one thing to do is a public awareness campaign in addition to, an educational program. And that's great because I love a program, I do. I love a presentation, I love a webinar, I love a discussion, but we want to up the dosage of that messaging. If you go to one webinar or training a year on stalking, that's great, but it's a lot better if we up the dosage by, and you're seeing messages about it, and then you got an email about it, and then you saw it on social media, that every once in a while it's kind of reminding you and bringing you back to that training and what you were focusing on. So we have some guides for creating public awareness campaigns. They're for campuses, but could also be for communities. A lot of the same lessons would apply. And so we have some pretty concrete guidance on that available on our website. Another really helpful way to engage folks in conversations on stalking that I think is a lot of fun is through media literacy. And so in our media, stalking is often shown these different ways. And while, again, the media isn't causing stalking, it does kind of miseducate people about what stalking is. And I think that media literacy and getting people to be critical of media is such a great tool for these kinds of issues, because once folks are being critical in that way, it's hard to turn off, right? You just start seeing things a little bit differently. So with stalking in media, one thing I'd say, actually for all media literacy, sometimes I see this done, in my opinion, a little bit poorly, in that it vilifies the media. Right. And so it's no one piece of media's fault that this is happening. It's really the cumulative effect. So I always say something like, look, if you like, this movie, this song, whatever, that's fine. It's not like that's bad that you like this or that this is speaking to you, but it's really the fact that we see this again and again and again without any countermeasure of actual education on this issue, and the cumulative effect and sort of this background noise of stalking that is making it seem romantic, funny, heroic, or edgy. And so to break this down a little bit more, we often see this in our romantic comedies, right, where our protagonist, I almost said offender, our protagonist offender is often, our male romantic lead, and he's trying again and again. And I see that framed as lack of consent, which is true, and not taking no for an answer, but it's also stalking, right? Just they're outside the door, they're outside the window, here they are again. You got that email, did you get my letter, did you get those flowers, right? Just that constant contact. And we see that, and usually it's our male protagonist, and it usually works, right? It's seen as, just don't take no for an answer, just keep on trying, she's playing hard to get, and eventually she'll say yes. And so we tend to empathize with our male protagonist there and not see the harm and see it as romantic. But it's not just in our romantic films, it's also shown as funny quite a bit. And it's a really common trope in cartoons if you think about it. That sense of, oh, there they are again. They do not understand boundaries, right? And it's played for laughs. We see that in sitcoms, in cartoons where like SpongeBob will not leave Squidward alone. We see that with, obsessive characters. Often if it's a female who's obsessed, it's especially played for laughs. It's like, oh my God, she is crazy, right? As when men do it, it's seen as romantic or edgy. But this idea that it's funny, that no one's getting hurt here. It's just kind of these awkward people or awkward sponges, right, who are not quite picking up social cues, and that's played for laughs, but no one's getting hurt. Can also be seen as heroic. And it might feel weird to have Mrs. Doubtfire and Batman on the same graphic, but stick with me. I do think there's a sense of watching over the people we love to protect them. So we see that quite a bit in our superhero films. Spider-Man's got to watch Mary Jane, and so he can swoop in and save her. And of course, that's what stalkers sometimes say. I trust you. I don't trust the people around you. That's why I have to watch you to make sure that you're safe. But also someone like Mrs. Doubtfire, right, where they're impersonating someone to stay close to the family, to keep an eye on things, and then actually sabotage the new relationship. I have a whole spiel about how Mrs. Doubtfire is like actually a terrifying stalker movie, if you think about it from the perspective of the family. But I won't get into that right now. But just think about it, that sense of, I need to watch what's going on here, and see what's going on because of my love for these people, because I need to keep them safe and keep them in my life. Or it's shown as kind of edgy and sexy, like, ooh, why that media went there, So like the popular show You, where it's definitely a thriller. The music video to Animals by Maroon 5, if you haven't seen it, I highly don't recommend it. But just being shown as like kind of edgy, sexy, wow, it's going there. This is dangerous, but in a fun way, like in a thriller fun way. And look, folks are allowed to like any of these things. I personally like seeing stalking in a horror movie because I'm like, that's right, it's scary. Put it in a horror movie. I think it's much worse when it's shown as romantic, funny, heroic, because that's normalizing it in a different way. But showing examples of different kind of subgenres, not only just saying stalking is normalized in the media, period. Sure, it is, but how and what different messages? Because it's not just the romance. There's also all these other little, or it's just awkward, or it's just funny, or something like that. We also have a stalking playlist that you can get to on our website. I love making themed playlists, so I was very excited I got to make this, but really a variety of genres and songs, all normalizing stalking in some way, shape, or form, either minimizing it, showing it as funny, showing it as sexy, etc. And again, no one song is to blame here, but it does create this kind of background noise that's normalizing stalking. And so how I use this playlist is when I do a training, I usually play this, before the training when people are coming in early and during the breaks. It can be interesting because to hear what other people think about it, again, it's kind of that passive learning kind of turns the brain on. There was a grantee who reached out because they're going to have a karaoke event where they're going to have folks sing some of these songs and then discuss stalking. And I'm like, ooh, that sounds like the best public awareness event. And so to get people just thinking about this and being, literate about media and music specifically. Because the problem is this creates kind of a fantasy, and I'm speaking a little bit to the romantic stalker here, but it creates this fake version of stalking where the stalker is an attractive stranger or secret admirer. But that's not true. The stalker is usually known to the victim and is usually a current or former intimate partner. The fantasy is that the stalker has pure intentions. They're usually romantic. And so even if they're going a little too far, it's in the name of love, and we know this person doesn't want to hurt anybody. But actually, most stalkers are trying to scare their victims. It's not an accident, right? They're out there working to scare their victims. That's exactly what they want to do. And the stalker's action range from sexy to flattering to harmless when, in fact, stalking can escalate quickly and often co-occurs with or predicts serious violence, including but not limited to rape, use of weapons, and homicide. And that how should the victim feel? Well, usually it's, they should feel amused, flattered, or affectionate. So if they're not interested, at least it was sweet that they tried. But actually, no, stalking is about feeling fear or emotional distress. And so this kind of constructed fantasy can play out in some really strange ways and lead victims to minimize what they're experiencing. So what are the impacts here? Again, I'm not saying this causes stalking, but it builds empathy with stalkers rather than victims, because often the stalker is the protagonist. So we're rooting for them. We want them to get the girl, right? And so it kind of builds that, no, they're good people. They just might be misunderstood or overzealous. It leads victims to minimize their experiences because, I've seen that before. And, I've seen that and I'm sure they just meant it to be sweet. It leads those potential supports or friends to minimize what's going on. That, are you overreacting? They probably just meant it to be nice. It misinforms the general public about the dangers and realities of stalking. And ultimately, that creates an environment where stalkers get away with it, where it seems like this is normal. And if you're upset about it, you're probably overreacting or you're not fun. And that's just not true or fair. A lot of people ask me about the show You, which of course features stalking really prominently. We have discussion guides on all 3 seasons of You. That's been a really popular program on campuses. And so to kind of take this kind of heightened thriller and see what are the stalking behaviors in here. What does this tell us about real stalking? What about this is maybe a little extra? And so that can be a great way to get people, and a great opportunity to get people talking about it. And again, goes back to my point about not vilifying the media, because so many people will be like, oh, you must hate that show. And I'm like, I think it's an opportunity for discussion. I think that it can help people. It can start a real conversation, and that's great. It's just, what are they saying in that? Well, as professionals in this field, let's try to steer that conversation towards real knowledge, awareness, and cultural change. So if you don't have time for your standalone, or you're looking for something a little bit different, there are also activity ideas that you can use as part of a program or as a standalone shorter program. So this one is a sorting activity, and basically the idea here is that stalking's contextual in nature, right? And so what you want to do, and we have these cards, you can get them on our website, are these examples. So if you're doing this in person, then you could have, big pictures of, we used to call it butcher paper. They probably don't call it that anymore. Big pieces of paper around with these labels, romantic, bullying, or cliques and stalking. And in small groups, hand out these behaviors and have your attendees talk through this. So, they send multiple texts a day to check in, regardless of whether or not you respond. Is that sweet? Oh my God, they're thinking about you. Is it bullying? Or what kind of check-in? Have you told them to stop and they're kind of freaking you out? Or is it stalking? You're scared and you really need this contact to stop. Or steals things like your textbook and jacket, so you have to go ask for them back. Is that flirting? Is that bullying? Is that stalking? And of course, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's really about thinking through the context of these different behaviors. But what this can do is help people think through, when I hear that, it doesn't sound scary, but I see how it could be. So it helps them think through the contextual nature of stalking, as well as that intersection of bullying or cliques and stalking is challenging. And I think when we're talking about anti-bullying education or harassment education, I always hope folks bring in stalking as well, because when we're talking about fear, we're really talking about stalking. And so there's an opportunity to make that distinction and talk about it a little bit more. Another activity we found successful is asking, how does stalking look, sound, and feel? So in this one, you have 3 pieces of butcher paper, big paper, and ask folks to either write or draw, what does stalking look like? What does it sound like? What might it feel like? And doing this as a starter can be interesting. And typically we allow increasing amounts of time because, you have them switch stations and the most obvious ones get taken first. And so people need a little more time to think about it. And so what's nice here is that it gets to the idea of the variety of stalking behaviors. That stalking could look like, a camera in the room, but it could also look like a gift. It could look like a fist, but it could also just look like an email. And so, having the group generate that idea that, oh yeah, it could look romantic or threatening or some combination, that it might immediately look scary or not. And similar around this, what does it sound like? It could sound like a direct threat. It could sound like a compliment. It could sound like a third party saying, hey, guess who I ran into? Or guess who was asking about you? It could sound like your phone constantly beeping, right? And what does it feel like? And of course, this gets at the sense that victims respond to trauma differently, that they might be very afraid, but they might also show it in terms of stress. They might feel angry. They might feel guilty because, oh, did I lead that stalker on? Should I have been nicer or something like that? They might feel like they're under a microscope. And so, again, getting to the diversity of stalking behaviors, the contextual nature of stalking, as well as the diversity of trauma responses is what we're getting at here, but in a way where we don't use any of the boring language I just did in the sentence, and we're just getting people to think about it more organically. So I think this can be a really good activity. We also have these stalking cards, and this is a nice one to do with, you can change up the questions depending on your audience. So like if I was using this for a group of professionals, I would give small groups these different, I'd cut these up, different cards, and have them discuss them amongst themselves. But basically you pick them in random order and then discuss the question. So I'm explaining this poorly. So like if these were your 6 cards, you could pick them in any order, right? They're turned over. You don't know what you're seeing first. After each one, you have a discussion, assuming it's the same course of conduct. And so you would ask folks, you know, how would you feel if this happened to you or a friend? Scared, vary these depending on who your audience might be. And so at what point does it become stalking? That becomes an interesting question, because if you get a camera hidden in your room and that's thing 1, you're like, okay, that sounds like stalking. This is realistic just because stalking doesn't always escalate right in a straight line. There might be periods of dormancy. There might be some behaviors that are more obvious. When does one that isn't become one? Is this reportable? How do you keep evidence on this? If you got a call about this as law enforcement, could you do it? Standalone program stuff. So we have a public awareness workshop that takes around an hour to an hour and a half. And this is, again, scripted with slides and handouts. Talk about it. Okay, now let's look at side 2 to see why this was scary. There's detailed instructions for this version and our general version. Both include a group activity that will include a video that we also have a written like script version for folks who don't have video capability, and discussion questions. And so here's just more resources that also, so we split it into know it, name it, and stop it. And so then it gives folks some action items like, how do you support a friend? How do you make sure you're not victim blaming? How do you get your friend help? And so again, I think these are great for either a campus awareness program. Again, if like this, you're supposed to be, right, educating folks about stalking. And if you're doing community education, my guess is that you have a program on dating abuse, on teen dating abuse, on sexual assault, right? And all of that's wonderful. So if possible, incorporate stalking in there and offer the stalking training. And we're always looking to add to this. But I've honestly heard really good feedback from folks that it's pretty easy to lead, and a little can go a long way here. And of course, we want to extend the message. Like I said, up that dosage, as we say. And so not only did you have the program or the activity, but you're regularly sharing stalking news, cases, and resources. You're integrating stalking into other awareness months, and you're reaching out to SPARC for more substantive training. So yeah, it's great to have a poster that says stalking that makes people think, oh yeah, stalking. But then, you know, annually, is there a stalking training? Are your new staff brought on with that? Is your staff comfortable with understanding the use of technology to stalk, or do they feel behind on that? You know, making sure that it's part of the rotation of topics that you're covering in all different ways. So a few different resources to help you in your work here. First, if you're building a program, reach out. So not only do we have these scripted programs that you can pick up and lead, but we can also provide guidance on programs that you've written. So we've had folks sometimes say, hey, you know, I want to have a stalking section of this. Is this good? Or what would you suggest? We can offer feedback to you on that free of charge. That's part of our role as a technical assistance provider. Or I want to do an activity, but this won't work for our group for some reason. You know, we can absolutely talk about that. If you're thinking, you know, I need an article or I need research on this community. Now, I will say that research on stalking is, there's less of it than research on how like domestic violence impacts specific communities, et cetera. That being said, we will absolutely do our best to get you case examples that are relevant. So if you're saying, you know, this is our community and we want a case that represents that for a case study, can you think of one? We'll do our best to get that to you and to find relevant research and resources for your community. So again, please feel free to reach out anytime with, hey, we're building this, we're adding this, we're piloting this. What do you all think, or do you have anything we can integrate? Also, the tech safety app. There's a lot of use of technology to stalk. And a lot of questions about technology and stalking are likely to come up in any program that you lead. And so you don't have to be a tech expert, but knowing where to find some of that information can be really helpful. And I think also being open to it, because especially if you're talking to younger folks and maybe don't consider yourself the most tech savvy, you want to make sure that you're not turning them off by saying like, well, all that stuff's optional, get off it. Or, I don't really understand all that, because that's kind of distancing yourself from their experience. So no, don't pretend that you're, obsessed with TikTok if you've never used it. But what you can do is make sure that you have basic information about what are some of the popular applications, what are some of the security concerns, what are some of the trends, and help enhance that victim safety as well if you're thinking about settings, password security, etc. So the National Network to End Domestic Violence Safety Net team has some really great resources on this. We can also offer training on the use of technology to stalk, but this is a great one too if you're working with students or with anyone. So I don't know why I said students, with any client, and they're worried about the use of technology to stalk, to at least have somewhere to go to learn a little bit more. Again, Victim Connect, the closest thing we have to a national stalking hotline, and so make sure you're promoting this as much as RAIN or the DV hotline. And of course, what we need most of all is coordination, and our awareness education is a really big part of that, because we need our awareness educators to be making sure that our victims identify stalking, that those friends and informal supports that they go to recognize stalking, and that they say, hey, let's get you some help. And when they do, that our organizations recognize it as well, that our victim service providers see stalking as a unique victimization, that they safety plan around it specifically, that our law enforcement recognizes it and charges it, that our prosecutors pick up those charges and argue them effectively, that our courts recognize the harms and the trauma and the violence of stalking, and that they sentence it appropriately, and that our probation, parole, and corrections folks continue to keep our victims safe and hold our offenders accountable. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And every week I read cases of homicide, violence, attempted homicide or violence, and then folks look back and see this whole history of stalking behavior. Often that was reported to different sources, but what happens is that different groups know different things. So, the prosecutor knew this, mental health knew this, victim advocate knew this, and no one's connecting the dots, and no one's building the sense of urgency that is so required. Because the truth is that our system is not set up to address stalking. It's set up to be incident-based. And so often our policies, practices, and discourse can get set up in that. There's a violent incident, we respond to that incident. But stalking just isn't like that. It's this complicated, contextual, sometimes long-term, often multi-jurisdictional, complicated series of tactics that make up the stalking case. And the truth is there's no one whose job it is to make sure this happens. Because usually when we lose a stalking victim, it's not because one person just did a bad job. It's not like, oh yeah, if that officer had called that one thing in, we would have been set. It's really a system failure. And so at this point, after this session, and especially if you've listened to our past sessions on stalking, you probably know more about stalking than most folks in our field, and certainly know where to go for more resources on it. So it kind of has to be you in whatever role you play, recognizing that, okay, I'm going to be an advocate for this victim. I'm going to help move this person through the system however they want to, and I'm going to talk about stalking and raise its profile in our general public awareness discourse, because right now it just really isn't there. Of course, our website is a great place where you can request training, request those brochures, get all that information. You know it, you love it, stalkingawareness.org. Again, practitioner guides, including specifically for awareness educators, training modules like the Know It, Name It, Stop It programs that I mentioned, discussion guides on the Show You. We have guidance for awareness educators on those activities that I mentioned and the cards, as well as some slides on the media. My just one slide on stalking, we have that up there, the playlist and more. Victim resources like these brochures, as well as just information on stalking and webinars. Again, if you're thinking, I do want to get a little more in touch with what is stalking, the diversity of behaviors, the intersections with other crimes. The good news is we have a lot of recorded webinars in the SPARC archives just about that, so you can get to that right away, or of course request a new training. We're happy to do that as well. And of course, social media. Follow us legally. Again, we won't be scared. We ask you to. We like it on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. It's a great way to just, the easiest thing you can do to build awareness year round is simply share our posts. Just share it. When we're sharing our teen dating violence post at SPARC, be like, oh yeah, share, right? Then now your audience is also thinking about the connection between teen dating violence, for example, and stalking. So I hope that you will follow us and sign up for our newsletter where we drop new resources and let you all know. This is my contact information. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for joining today. I know that it's a lot of information and it's a big ask. You're already doing quite a lot to keep victims safe and holding offenders accountable. And it's easy for me to sit here and say, do this, think about that, add this, do this exercise. But you're the ones who are actually on the ground doing the work. It's all easier said than done. And I totally understand that. So thanks so much for the critical work that you do and for your attention to stalking this month and year round. And with that, I will see the rest of my time to questions, if there's any that came up in the Q&A. And I know folks often ask about certificates. So just a reminder, yes, you can email info@stalkingawareness.org and you will get a certificate. We're a small staff, so you'll get it sometime soon. We'll work on it. But again, thank you all so much and keep in touch. And I'll stick around for any questions. These are, I'm looking at the Q&A and some of these are marked answered, but I'm not sure they are. So I'm just going to go through them. And certainly if you have more, please feel free to put them in here. Someone asked, how do you respond to people who say the stalker probably doesn't even know what they're doing or is harming a victim? Is it true that stalkers are often unaware that they're stalking? No, most stalkers know that they're stalking and they are absolutely doing that in order to scare their victims. And I think just explaining that to folks that it's not an accident, it's not a misunderstanding. Another thing is, from a criminal justice perspective, if there is some kind of knock it off from law enforcement or from the victim, if the victim uses language like, you are scaring me, stop, and then the offender persists, it's pretty hard to argue, well, they didn't know they were scaring that person. And so I think some of it's just that education and again, that romanticization of stalking, that people want to give the stalker the benefit of the doubt when really, why? We want to be empathizing with victims, not with stalkers. Let me see. Someone asked, would you recommend doing these activities before or after explaining stalking? I think you can argue a different way for your group. So, I can go back and forth as an awareness educator who writes quite a bit of curriculum. Sometimes it's good to just throw it out there and see what comes up. And then you can say, hey, just like you all said, I agree with you. Let me just formalize what you said into this. So for like the what does stalking look like, sound like, feel like, sometimes that's an interesting one to just throw out there without having defined stalking, without having talked about the contextual nature of stalking, because people will get there on their own. If you're thinking, I don't know if this audience is going to get there on their own, then you might want to start with a short, and I often do start with a short overview of, hey, just to get everyone on the same page, some of you may know, some of you may not, here's what stalking is. It's a problem, it's prevalent. Here are the basic foundations. It's a pattern of behavior. It's directed at a specific person. It's about fear. Okay, now go, right? Now discuss it. And then you might get more advanced answers or a richer set of answers. And so, often you can certainly see how it's scaffolded within our programs that we've written. And so we've been thoughtful about that. But I think different groups, different audiences, different programs, you can kind of arrange a different way. Different ways, excuse me. Let's see. Someone asked, this is a great question. My organization is a rape crisis center for 3 surrounding counties. We deal with sexual trauma and violence under the umbrella term, and we try to mention stalking, but we don't really have the capacity, any ideas. I hear you and I feel for you and I totally understand. It's really hard to be asked to, hey, on top of all the other work you're doing, add stalking to it. I think what I'd say is that there are some resources that make it not so burdensome. So just screening for stalking, adding that as a routine thing your staff does, having the stalking poster, figuring out if you can't help that victim, where do you refer them? Where's the local shelter where they could go? What are some other services that might be available in your community? Knowing about the national resources. So while we don't provide direct services, yes, I can hand you this brochure, I can give you this information, I can have you do a safety assessment, I can give you a documentation log. All of those are things we have on our website. And also just building it into what you're already doing. So understanding that, no, you're not going to start your second stalking wing within your current funding and staff capacity, but could every staff member make sure that they attend a training on stalking once a year and that you include those screening questions in your intake? Like, even that would be a big jump, right? And often people will say, oh, we're not seeing a lot of stalking cases. And often it's that it's not identified, right? Just like when people saying, oh, there's not sexual assault here. And we're like, right, it's not being reported. And so just training your staff on picking it out and then seeing where they can go next. So I know that doesn't quite answer your question in terms of we don't have all this capacity to do all these things, but I think finding small ways to integrate it within your capacity and also identifying other resources in your community or nationally that you think might be helpful could be a way to go. Let's see, I'm just looking at questions here. So I'm just looking through. Okay. So I'm just asking, is there an organization that will, with phone monitoring, stalkerware on the rise, is there an organization that will analyze the phone to identify what stalkerware the stalker has installed? So nationally, not that I'm aware of. Different law enforcement officers have different forensic capabilities. So you might have some where they have a really great, forensic center working with stalking and technology, and some who don't. I will say with stalkerware specifically, it can be really hard to detect, and no matter what the capacity is, it's possible for it to get missed. And so usually our best indicator for is there stalkerware on the phone is really those contextual things that the offenders seem to know different things about that victim across platforms. They heard the phone call, they saw the text message, but they also read the email and saw the search history, and all these contextual things that are kind of indicating, they must have access to the phone. And so that's really how we find out most of the time, is that the victim says, I think someone's monitoring my phone. Now, there's a lot of different points of entry that can mimic stalkerware, and I'm happy to talk to you about this in a different, if you want to follow up with me later. But for example, if someone knows, your iCloud credentials and they put a GPS tracker on your car, that can really mimic stalkerware in terms of different points of access and information to that victim, right? So usually it's not stalkerware. Usually it's something else. So there are some tools to help. There is, Julia, help me. It's the Kaspersky. There is a application that can help, but you need your local agency to download it separately on its own device. If you follow up with me after, I will tell you what it is and use proper nouns. So sorry about that. So there are some tools being developed. There's the Coalition Against Stalkerware, which we're a part of, which is international, which is really wonderful. So, there are some resources being developed, but in terms of here's the place to go to get this handled, I can't really give you that, or at least I'm not aware of it. It would probably be more local. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Someone asked, any places besides NAVDV for technology facilitated stalking resources? So they're great. They have a lot of resources on technology. IACP Cyber Center is great. And also we offer training on the use of technology to stalk. We just don't have it on our website because we don't want to give stalkers ideas on how to stalk. And so it's usually by request. We'll provide an agency a training on the use of technology. But even just honestly, doing the work to Google it. And I don't mean that to be patronizing. I just mean the truth is there's no one expert on technology. This stuff is always evolving or devolving, depending how you think about it, quickly. There's always something people brought up that I'm like, oh, I've never even heard of that. And then you realize there's a whole world of it. So really just Googling, how do AirTags work? How AirTag stalking, and looking at a couple examples. And also recognizing that you don't need to be an expert on all technology. The big take-home points are just to realize that this is out there, that it's easy for a lot of folks to use. You don't have to be super tech savvy to be using these as a stalking offender, that a lot is possible, and that it's a power trip for offenders. And that, there's places to go for more information. So the most important thing you can do is believe victims, validate them, and say, technology is used all sorts of innovative ways, for better or worse. In your case, unfortunately, for worse. I'm going to connect with someone to get to the bottom of this, right? That goes a long way. So, of course, it's great to educate yourself on technology, settings, etc. But you also don't need to have a deep understanding of every kind of tech to be able to help a victim and say, well, this exists and it's possible this is what they're doing. So I don't know. I hope that's helpful. Let's see. Someone asks, how do you know if a stalker's moved on or is just lying low? That's tough. You don't always know, unfortunately. And so many victims talk about, they always come back. It's never really over. We have our serial stalkers as well, who sometimes go from one victim and then they leave them alone because now they're fixated on a second victim or a third victim. And so I don't know if there's any one way to know for sure. I would say that certainly being vigilant is good. Being mindful of privacy over time is good practice, for any victim of stalking. And it depends. Stalkers, the recidivism rate is high, for stalking offenders. They're deterred by different things. So about half the time a protection order works and that offender doesn't reoffend. And so if someone's responsive, if an offender's responsive to that kind of intervention, then great, let's make sure that stays in effect as much as possible, that we're pursuing those legal options because that works. If you have an offender where that only makes them angry and worse, okay, maybe we want to go that route, maybe we don't, right? And so there's no one answer for what will deter or stop different stalking offenders, unfortunately. So yeah, I wish that's a really good question, and I wish I had a good answer for you. And certainly if other folks have strategies, feel free to share, but I don't have a really great, here's how you know they're done. Let me see. Sorry, I'm just looking through the questions here to see. There's a couple questions that essentially are saying folks are not taking me seriously, or my organization doesn't take folks seriously when they report stalking unless they need proof. And it's true that, documenting everything is great. That having, and it's kind of unfair to victims to ask them to, take that picture, take that screenshot, record it, ask the witness to come in. All of that, it's a lot of work for victims, but it's also really important because when most victims get, say, an upsetting or threatening text message, they want to delete it, understandably. But actually saving it for that evidence can go a really long way. And so absolutely, we do know that can happen sometimes, that people say, well, it happened, but I can't prove it. And so as much as possible, yes, save the evidence, talk to witnesses. Another thing is that evidence of accommodation. So if the victim, say, changes their phone number, they are taking different routes to and from work, they buy a new security camera, that is also, as far as I'm concerned, evidence of the changes they're going through because of the stalking victimization. That also illustrates fear or distress. And then if they have things like, a game cam, the problem with cameras is that they can be used to catch a stalker, or if a stalker gains access to them, they can be used to watch the victim, right? So it can go both ways, but certainly it can be good practice, or it could be helpful. Some stalking victims really like having those. And I think that telling folks about it, and of course some victims don't want to do that, but having more eyes on the situation is always helpful. And just recognizing that, a lot of stalking victims are told they're crazy or that they're being paranoid or might feel that way. But the truth is they're not being paranoid, they're being hypervigilant because of this repeated trauma where someone is often trying to get to them. They are now reacting appropriately, right? And so that may come off as an overreaction from other people to other people who don't understand what that victim's going through. And then I think this is the last question I'll take here. How do you balance delivering accurate information and statistics and scaring people who are stalking victims, like making them wonder if they are experiencing slow motion homicide? That's a great question. How do you tell people this is a real problem without just terrifying them? Great question. I'm not sure if I've quite answered that one for myself 100% of the time. But I think talking in terms of averages and not avoiding absolute statements. And so, I won't even say never use absolute statements because I won't use absolute statements. That, the sense of on average, these are the most dangerous. In your situation, maybe, maybe not. I don't know. It's going to depend. These are the averages. This is the big picture. And reminding folks they're individuals, right? That their case might be, like the average duration of a stalking case is 2 years. Some cases last one afternoon, some last a lifetime. So what does that average really tell us? Well, it's helpful to know, okay, what might happen, but it doesn't mean this will happen. And so I think saying this is descriptive, it's not predictive in terms of this describes the big picture of what goes on here. So you want to be mindful of that. And I'm not saying this will happen to you. I'm also focusing on the action-oriented steps they can take, that you can document, you can report, you can ask a friend for help, you can, make a safety plan, that you can do these different things rather than minimize it. And so it's a really fine line because honestly, I think with all the minimization around stalking, I would probably err on the side of scaring people a little bit more, but certainly you're not trying to overly alarm your victims or have them become even more upset. I'd say also doing the SHARP assessment's a really good idea because that's very individual to their case and creates a specific risk profile for what they are experiencing. And so if they're saying, well, I don't think it's that bad, be like, okay, good. I hope it's not. Maybe it's not. Like, awesome. Let's go through it and actually talk about what you're experiencing. And what the risk level might be, and if it's low, medium, high, et cetera, and go from there. So I think just treating each victim like an individual. And if you're talking about stalking broadly, to say, hey, this is serious, this can happen. I'm not saying it will, I'm not saying it is, but big picture, this is what we see on average. Okay, so I'm about out of time here, but thank you all so much for your attention and for your for all your work all the time and for your engagement in this webinar. I really appreciate it. Thanks for participating in National Stalking Awareness Month. I hope to see you all on social media, sharing more, doing more, and I look forward to it. So please keep in touch with us and have a good rest of your day.